So welcome everybody to the first sort of, I guess this is actually officially the second time we've done this. The first time we tested a couple things out a number of months ago, and I just thought we would get restarted here. The goal behind these sessions is once a month, lunch and learn. I book it for an hour. I expect maybe about 45 minutes of time, and we'll just go through a topic of some sort. So back a few months ago, we talked about identity and access management. And I thought today we would look at a number of AWS services that we consider kind of, must-have security solutions. So I've got my little cheat sheet here, and instead of looking at slides, I thought it would be much more interesting to actually look in the console and kind of walk you through all of the different bits and pieces. So let's hop right in. If you have questions, just throw them in the chat box there, and we can address them here, or follow up after the fact and get you some info. Okay, so that's the goal. The first thing I wanted to discuss was a service that we talked about in the very first version of the OrbitLIVE session, and that's identity and access management. And these sessions are really meant to be, not super deep dive into particular services. So we are going to keep it like kind of 100 level look at this, but identity and access management is probably the most important security service in AWS. If you're not familiar, what IAM does is it controls who or what has access to your AWS account and what actions it can perform against the resources within your account. And we won't go any deeper than this particular slide, but really what you do within the identity and access management service is you create entities, right? So we have groups, we have users, we have roles, and we have policies. Those are the four main components that I want to just kind of review today. The first thing is a user. The one misconception with a user is that it's a person. It does not have to be a person, right? So a user could be an application, could be something that needs permanent access to your AWS account, whether that is a person or an application. The thing with users is what I mentioned already. They have permanent access. And in general, we would dissuade as best we can from people creating users within their AWS accounts because of the permanent access idea. That just means there's more for us to manage within IAM or within the AWS account. But the other thing is what quite often happens is when you're creating a user, you're able to provide it with access keys. And access keys, as it says right here, are permanent credentials that allow programmatic access to the AWS environment. So you get an access key and a secret access key. We audit a lot of AWS accounts, and this is routinely the biggest issue that we highlight for people. And this is why we generally say avoid IAM wherever you can, because there is no built-in automated mechanism to force the rotation of access keys within your account. So generally what we end up seeing is very old access keys, sometimes haven't been rotated in multiple years. Okay? So just remember with IAM, in particular IAM users, I should say, permanent access to your AWS account for a person or potentially an application. And quite often when people are creating these IAM users, they're assigning access keys. And access keys is going to be one of the biggest challenges. So we generally try to avoid this situation by not creating those permanent users in the first place. Users should be logically organized into groups. Okay. And the reason that we'd like to organize users into groups is because we want to assign permissions to those IAM users at the group level, rather than having to manage access or permission, at the individual user level. Okay. Since I mentioned avoiding an IAM user, the path that we generally try to follow is a role-first approach. A role is a way to give, again, a person, an application, potentially another AWS service, temporary access to your environment. What's great about that is the fact that there's nothing really for us to, well, let me say it this way. It reduces the amount of security risk by providing us temporary credentials and rotating those credentials automatically for us, unlike the permanent situation where we're responsible for rotating those credentials. But also now, we still have to assign permissions to those roles, but it's just an easier process to manage. Our approach is generally start with a role first, and then only fall back to a user where you, in a situation where you can't do something with a role, okay? So temporary permissions, permanent permissions. The last thing I just want to mention here is policy. So I've mentioned already, assigning permissions. The way that you assign permissions within IAM is through a policy. The thing to keep in mind with IAM is that by default, it denies all access, and you then create policies that either allow access or, again, explicitly deny access. The way that you do that is through policies. Again, we won't get into this in any sort of depth here today, but within policies, you have policies that are created and maintained by AWS. Those are called AWS Managed Policies. And then you would have policies that are created and maintained by us. Those are customer managed policies. Okay. Regardless of the type of policy that you decide to use, the intent of a policy is to provide least privilege access to your AWS environment for the entity or entities that you assign this permission to, whether it's a role, whether it's a group, or whether it's an IAM user. Okay. That's what policies are all about. They're JSON documents. Okay. That's all they are. One of the things that I would say is kind of like a skill that I would want people to learn is how to actually read and understand a policy statement that you may have in your account. They're relatively simple documents, but they can be complex in the fact that you might have a lot of different permissions. You might have allow statements, you might have deny statements, you could have a mix of those statements. So the complexity comes from the size of an individual policy, but actually just reading the JSON document is relatively simple. Okay. So that's the first kind of what I would consider must-have security service. IAM is a global service, means that resources that I'm creating here, this is our little kind of demo account. That's why it's completely empty like this. If I create a user or a role in here, those roles are essentially available across all of the regions that exist within this account. But they are governed by the permission statements that are assigned to those particular roles or those particular entities. Okay, so that's IAM. The next thing that I want to talk about is KMS. So the key management service. One of the most important lines of defense that you have in AWS is to encrypt all of your data. Werner Vogels, who's the CTO of Amazon, a number of years ago at reInvent, he said something along the lines of, I'm going to paraphrase, like, dance like nobody's watching, encrypt like everyone is. And it's funny, I mentioned already that when we audit customers' accounts, we often find some opportunities for improvement in identity and access management, particularly around the entities that they've created there and the permissions that are assigned to those entities. The other thing that we routinely see is a lack of encryption. Okay? And what's great about KMS is that it natively supports a ton of AWS services. So the process of actually protecting your data at rest, if you're using an Amazon sort of native solution, is really simple. You simply say, hey, you know what? When you create this database, an RDS database, I want you to encrypt the data. And this is the key that I want you to use. There's two types of keys that you can see here. There's actually three, but we're going to just talk about these two types of managed keys. So AWS can manage keys on your behalf within KMS, or you can create your own managed keys. So that's an AWS managed versus a customer managed key. The difference is that a customer managed key, a CMK, it gives us more control. So if I was to go in here and actually create a key, you can see some different options here. This is kind of more out of scope than what I want to get into today, but you can see that you can have KMS generate these keys for you. You can bring in your own key material. You can create keys that could be potentially used across multiple regions. But I'm just going to say next, and we're going to create our key. An alias is just an easy way to refer to a key. What I'll show you here in a second is when you create a KMS key, it's going to have a very long identifier. And just like domain names and IP addresses, it's easier to remember the domain name than an IP address. An alias is kind of the same thing. Right? So I can give it a description if I want, tag it with some additional information. So like I might do something like this, right? Who owns the key? Maybe what project this key is used for. And the reason that I would want to tag these resources is I can use tagging later on for automation, for searching. It's really important, just in general best practice, to tag resources that exist within your AWS account. When I click next, what we're doing here is we're actually creating what is called a key policy. Who or what can manage the key, and then who or what can use the key. So I'm just going to click a couple things here. We won't worry about it in any great detail. I really just want to show you the outcome of this. And this is where a customer managed key gives us that additional flexibility. Here's a key policy. Okay? So I mentioned already policy documents that you create within IAM. Those would be referred to as identity policies. Identity policies are created, maintained within the IAM service. A lot of different AWS services also support what are called resource policies. These are policies, they're no different than the policies that you would create within IAM, but these are policies that are embedded directly into a resource. So in my example here, this is a key policy, a resource policy that provides us with an additional layer of protection for whatever resource. So in this case, this is an extra piece of security that we would wrap around this key. And when I click finish, there's my demo key. And I'll just show you one other thing. Where is it here? Oh, right here. Oh, I didn't turn it on. I missed that. This is another benefit of using a customer managed key. You can enable key rotation on this. So on a yearly basis, the key management service will automatically rotate the key, right? The key material, so that you're regularly using a new key. You're not just using that same key all the time. Okay. So that's the KMS service. Remember that KMS is a solution that allows us to protect our data at rest within the AWS service or within the AWS ecosystem, let's say, and it works with a large list of AWS services. What's also interesting about KMS, if you wanted, is you could extend its functionality using one of the Amazon provided SDKs, and you could use KMS in your own custom built applications if you wanted to. Okay. So that's KMS. The next service that I wanted to just provide a high-level overview is the CloudTrail service. And you can see in this particular environment, I don't have what I'm going to call a custom trail built. Okay. What does Trail do? Trail captures activity that's happening within your AWS account. This, unlike IAM, which is a global service, CloudTrail is a regional service, which means generally you would want CloudTrail running in every region within your AWS account, even if you're not operating in one of those regions, right? Let's say, in my case here, you can see I'm in the CA Central region. Let's say this is the only region I'm going to use, okay? I would still, and I'm going to show you what this looks like, I would still create what they call global trail, because what if somebody or something starts operating in another region? What CloudTrail will do is record all of the activity, all of the API calls that are being made within your AWS account. And essentially, everything we do is an API call. What I'm doing in the console here, these are all the things that I'm clicking on, and we're looking at different configurations. All of this is making API calls behind the scenes. And out of the box, CloudTrail is enabled to a certain point, and it will record all of that information. So let me just show you. If we go over to the dashboard, Okay, we don't have any trails, but CloudTrail will automatically start collecting data. And you can see here, if I just get rid of the filters, this is me as I'm going through all of these different consoles. I'm clicking through the web GUI. I'm making API calls. So this is really important. It's important because it can help you meet your security, compliance, or audit programs by, well, capturing this information and storing it somewhere to meet your requirements. It's also, we use it all the time for a troubleshooting tool. Because of the very high level of granularity that exists within AWS to control access to the services, what you'll often find is if you're practicing least privilege, you're going to have to adjust those permissions over time. And often we end up using CloudTrail to do that. You'll notice here, this column, error code, right? It's all blank. Great. So I have access. I'm logged in here as an administrator, so we shouldn't run into a problem. But let's say you've created a least privilege permissions policy for a particular role within your environment, and that role, for whatever reason, doesn't have access to a particular service. Well, you would see an access denied call in here. And if you click this, you get a JSON document that provides you with all of the detailed information about this particular API call. What I could do now is I could use this information to then modify my IAM policy and say, in this case, okay, I need to give that role the ability to talk to KMS and run this particular API call. So this is why it's really important for troubleshooting. Now, as I mentioned, you'll notice that CloudTrail is enabled, but you don't have any way to store data long-term. The process of setting this up is relatively simple, right? I'm going to do this through the console here. If we were doing this in a customer's account, we would actually do all of this programmatically, but I just want to run through it and highlight some things that you should be aware of. So there's our trail name. CloudTrail will log data to an S3 bucket. You have two options here. You can create a new bucket or you can use an existing bucket. We're just going to let it create a bucket on our behalf. So you can see the name that it creates. Okay? And here's our first example of using KMS. What we've got here is we're encrypting all of these log files using server-side encryption. That's what SSE is for, right? Powered by KMS. All the log files that we write to this bucket are protected at rest with KMS. Okay? We're going to create here a new customer managed key. So I'll just call this Brett. Okay. A couple other things that you should look at is you definitely want log file validation enabled. This provides you with the ability to see if, basically, if somebody or something tampers with a log file, you would get a report that says, okay, this particular log file has been modified. Essentially what it's doing is generating a hash, and then on a regular basis, comparing the hash that was generated versus the hash. If we generated a new hash right now, do those match? Right? So that's what it's doing. You can enable notification through the simple notification service. I generally leave this turned off. You can imagine in a very active AWS account, you're going to get a lot of notifications. You can also turn on CloudWatch logs. So now we've got log data going to S3, log data to go into CloudWatch. And I would normally do this. The reason that I do this is quite often the data going into S3 it's gzipped, it's not necessarily easy for me to look at. Quite often we'll see customers use that for integration with security event management tools, things like that. The CloudWatch logs feature here is great because now I can use the CloudWatch logs insights tool to search for particular things. I just find this more easily consumed by a person who's troubleshooting versus here. It's great to be able to dump this data into an S3 bucket and then tie something to it. Okay, so we'll turn that on. We are going to let it create a role. So I'll just give it an example here. Here's a great sort of real life example of a role. What we're doing here is we're allowing the CloudTrail service to talk to another service on our behalf. In this case, it uses a role to get temporary access to the CloudWatch log service to dump log files in there. And then, it unassumes the role. Just like we did before, I'll just tag this, right? We'll just do that as an example. We say next. By default, you get management events. You can turn on data events and insight events. Both of these would give us additional information about what's happening within the environment, but they will cost us extra money. Not a ton, and they're quite helpful. So I would normally turn on data events. I won't do it for today. Data events help us understand activity that's happening at the object level to, objects that exist within our S3 buckets. I'm going to leave it off for now. And we'll leave these defaults and we'll say next. The summary slide, and we'll say create. Assuming that I got everything done here correctly, what should happen always takes longer when you're sitting watching it, right? There we go. So here's our new trail. The first thing you'll notice is it's a multi-region trail. By default, CloudTrail will essentially collect data from all of the regions in your AWS account by default. We've turned insights off. This is an interesting feature that really, I should include in our must-have security services. This is AWS Organizations. AWS Organizations can help you manage a multi-AWS account deployment. It's kind of one of those things, though, that at least for today, we're gonna say is out of scope. Maybe we'll talk about organizations in the future. There are various AWS services that support AWS organizations. And you can see here, CloudTrail is one of those services. You can deploy what's called an organizational trail, which would set up CloudTrail across all of the accounts within your AWS organization. In this case, we left it as a non-organizational trail, which means it's just in this particular account. There's our S3 bucket, no prefix for that. There's our CloudWatch log group. If I was to open this up, right, here's all the details. Now, if I go back to the trail console, actually all the way back here now, you'll see a slight difference, right? Now we have a trail. The idea with CloudTrail is what I say is you have to finish the configuration, meaning you have to set up a trail. If you do have an organization's deployment, the trail will be there by default for you when you create the new account through the AWS organizations service. I'll just show you really quickly now. If I drill into here and I go, where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay, that's my CloudWatch log group name. So we'll just open up a window and we can go over to CloudWatch. And we go to log groups, we'll have a new log group here. There's our new log group, okay? This is what I was mentioning. I could go to log insights. I can select our log group and run a query against it. There's probably nothing in here yet, but quite often we'll end up using this because what I can do is I can look for access denied errors and I could query over a particular period of time. This is a really easy way to scrape through that CloudTrail log data very quickly. And so that's CloudTrail. The other service I wanted to just briefly mention is config. Config is, the way I think about config is it's a configuration management database, a CMDB for AWS. So a lot of people might think, oh, well, what does that have to do with security? I won't set this up today because there's a little bit more that we have to do for this. But when we think about config, what config will do is it will discover when resources are provisioned within your account. You stand up a new EC2 instance. It's going to see that, okay? And then what it does is over time, it creates a timeline or an event history of all of the activity that's happening to that particular configuration item, right? If we use the term for a CMDB inside config. The other really interesting thing about config is when you have now this CMDB and then you have it combined with CloudTrail, you have a very clear picture of who or what made a change within your AWS account. When did it happen, right? And what was the outcome? Because now I can visualize the outcome of that change here in config, but I could also then dive into the CloudTrail data to get the API calls that were made. Okay. So this is config. The other really interesting thing about config from a security perspective is it has something called config rules. Config rules are a way that you could use the AWS config service to help you understand your compliance. So you could have a series of rules that would lay out, well, your compliance requirements in a particular AWS account. And what config would do is it would evaluate all of the resources in your account against those config rules, and a config rule would be marked compliant or non-compliant. So you can get a quick view of where you are. Okay. Let's actually see here if we can do this very quickly. So I'm going to set up config. We're going to record all resources supported in this region. Okay. Or you can, say specific resource types. This is interesting. So first off, config, unlike CloudTrail, right, will not automatically capture resources across all of the AWS regions in your account. You do want to ensure that you are recording global resources, but you would want to make sure that you only include global resources in a single region. So let's say I go to the US to East 1 region, Northern Virginia, and I set up config over there. I would want to make sure that I really only check this box in a single region. Okay. Otherwise, it's just you're gonna collect more data, and therefore config's gonna cost you more money. Here's another example of a role. Now, a service linked role would be an example of a role that is created on your behalf by an AWS service. So you're going to see this in your console, but you're not able to change it. This, again, is how config is going to talk to the other services in our account. Basically, the service link role is going to give config the access it needs to collect data and store information. Okay. I'm going to go the easy way here and say create a new bucket. If we were doing this in real life, we would have a single bucket where we could push all of our logging data. Okay. But for today, we're just going to leave it like this. And again, we could stream configuration changes to SNS. I generally wouldn't do that because you could end up with a lot of notifications. So we're going to say next. And here's an example of rules. You can create your own managed rules, but Amazon provides a ton of out-of-the-box managed rules. I won't actually, let's turn one of these on. We'll just grab this one here. So it'll give you an example of compliant versus non-compliant. So we'll just turn that one on. We'll say next, we get the review screen, and we say confirm. So this is going out and setting up config. This might take a little bit of time to do some stuff. As I say that, it's done. There we go. Okay. And here's what we're going to see. Okay. You get this nice little dashboard. Obviously, there's not really anything in this account. We'll let it go for a little bit of time here. And before we finish today, we'll come back and we'll see if that rule has fired. Okay. So that's config. When you combine AWS config with CloudTrail, you get a really clear understanding of the activity that's happening within your account. Config is also a requirement for a service that I want to touch on later on. Okay. I'm going to jump back over to IAM very quickly and just point out one additional feature of IAM that is really important. So down the left-hand sidebar here, we looked at this top piece here around access management, but we also have something called the access analyzer. Now, this may be turned on. Okay, it's not great. The access analyzer is something that you should turn on. We would say it should be turned on in every one of your accounts. This is another example of a service that supports an organization's deployment. So at the organization's level, we can ensure that the access analyzer is enabled. Okay, and what it does is it analyzes your IAM permissions, and it looks for any permissions that provide access outside of what Amazon calls a zone of trust. So the zone of trust could be a single AWS account like this, or it could be an entire AWS organization. We're going to turn it on. Okay, we have to give it a name. I'm going to get rid of that name and we'll just call it demo for here. You can tag it before, like we did before, and see this current account. This is our zone of trust. Now, if you're doing this with organizations, you would have more of an option, but our zone of trust is going to be set to this particular account. We could tag it again, and we just create the analyzer. Okay. What it's doing right now is it's looking at the roles. There we go. Didn't take it very long. What this is doing is it's looking at the permissions that you've created within your account that allow access from outside of your zone of trust. So what it's showing us here are permissions. You can see what they are, right? These are particular roles in this case that are allowing access to this particular account outside of our zone of trust, which is the individual account. If I drill into these, you can get some more information. This is also interesting in the fact that, you might look at this and go, well, this is intended access. I understand what this is, and it's okay. You can archive the findings. Like, this is a great example. We use CloudFormation for everything. And this is a role that allows our centralized implementation of GitLab access to this account through a role assumption to deploy resources on our behalf. So what I would do is I'd say that's archived. Okay. And now if I go back over here, you can see it's gone, right? Because what we're doing there is we're saying, hey, we know what this is. This is okay. For all of these, actually, I could mark these as archived because I know what they are. They're part of our organization's deployment. One last thing I'll mention here are, you'll notice archive rules. So what you could do in here is you could say, okay, if account XYZ has access to this environment, like if I create a new role that has that access, just automatically archive it, because that's another account that I own, and I'm okay with cross-account access between those two environments. Okay, so that's the feature of Iam Access Analyzer. The Iam Access Analyzer provides us with the ability to do some additional analysis. If you notice in S3, we have the same thing for S3. Okay. The Access Analyzer for S3 does kind of the same thing, but for S3. It looks for S3 buckets that have public access. It looks for S3 buckets that allow access from other AWS accounts, okay, including accounts that you might not own. The S3 Access Analyzer relies on the Iam Access Analyzer. Okay, so you got to turn on the Iam Analyzer first. Again, we don't have anything really in this account except a couple deployed buckets, the ones that we created today for the demo, and a CloudFormation bucket. And you can see none of them are public and none of them provide access outside of our AWS account. Another service I wanted to highlight today is GuardDuty. GuardDuty is a service that uses machine learning. I'm going to go back over here. Okay. It uses machine learning and a number of different threat intelligence services to essentially help identify situations that would indicate possible AWS account compromise or possible compromise of particular resources within your account. Okay. Now, this is turned on already. Here's another example of an organizationally aware service. When I provisioned this account last night, I put it in our AWS organization, and that organization deployment says I have a GuardDuty deployment that needs to be enabled on all the accounts within my org. Okay, so it's already turned on. We don't have any findings here, but these findings might say, there's unusual activity happening at the account level. Somebody's trying to log in from an IP address that isn't something we've normally seen. It would flag it as a finding here. The thing that we see most people trip up on this one is, what do you do with the findings, right? Notifications outside of the GuardDuty service, they're important, obviously. Okay, so that's GuardDuty. And then I wanted to just briefly talk about another really important service, Security Hub. So Security Hub is a centralized location where you can understand potential security risks across what they call a number of standards for one or multiple accounts. This is the example of the service I mentioned earlier on that relies on config. If you turn on Security Hub in your AWS account without config already there, it will work. And you can see kind of that's the situation we're in here, because this is enabled by default. it will work, but it won't collect all of the data. So that's why you're seeing up here, no pass, no fail. What Security Hub does is for all of the various, like if I click on this, see all these findings, okay? What it does is for quite a few of these, let's just use this one as an example, it would create a config rule. And in this example, the config rule would look for all the CloudFront distributions with a particular configuration. And the ones that match that configuration would be marked compliant. The ones that did not would be marked non-compliant. Config is a requirement for Security Hub. Okay. Now, in this particular case, because this is enabled by default and config we don't have set up in our organization deployment, what I would have to do here is disable Security Hub and then recreate or re-enable Security Hub, and it would create for me all of the config rules that it requires, and then it would start saying compliant or non-compliant, which would provide us with pass-fail. Okay, so that's Security Hub. Those are the services that I wanted to kind of walk through today. I'm going to jump back into config and see if that managed rule fired for us and gives us a compliant or non-compliant status. So let's go over there and have a look at that. There we go. Okay. So it's compliant because I knew this would be green because this account is part of our AWS organization. I could go over here under rules. There's our single rule. And I could click on it. And you can imagine here, this isn't a great example, but you would then be able to look at the configuration of the resources and say, what is compliant, what is not compliant, look at all of them. Okay. Here are the details for the rules. So this checks periodically once every 24 hours. Okay. It's an AWS managed rule. So you can actually go in here and kind of set some of this stuff up if you wanted. So I can go in and say, maybe I can't change this one. Sometimes what you can do is even in a managed rule, you can go in here and you can make some changes, like set the parameters to particular values, things like that. Okay. So those are kind of the services that I wanted to review today as kind of the must-have things that we want to see in a customer's account. So IAM is there by default. And remember that IAM is how we control who or what has access to our environment. We've got the key management service or KMS. It's there by default, but won't have any keys in it. That's how you protect your data at rest within Amazon. CloudTrail is a great audit troubleshooting tool. It's going to record every API call that's happening within your environment. And you saw today, even just going through the management console, those are all API calls. Config is Amazon's configuration management database, CMDB. It captures resources and looks at the history of those resources throughout their lifespan. When you combine Trail and Config together, you get a really clear understanding of what's happening in your account. I talked about the 2 Access Analyzer versions. We've got IAM and S3. Both of them analyze those particular services to look for potential access from outside of your accounts or your zones of trust. You can then review those findings and take remediating action if you needed to, or you could say, hey, this is okay, I know what this is. And then we looked briefly at guard duty, which can help you identify potential breaches at the account level, potential breaches at particular service level. And then Security Hub gave us that single pane of glass where we can understand the overall compliance of an AWS account or potentially multiple AWS accounts, depending on your deployment, and then take action again on the findings there that you fail where they make sense for your particular environment. So that's the webinar today, folks.